Hey there guys, it's Metro and welcome to the tank spec tier list for Mythic Plus dungeons made specifically for Battle for Azeroth Season 2. In this video, I'll be ranking all 6 tank specs based on their ability to impact 5-man Mythic Plus groups and making direct comparisons along different metrics for all 6. It is made up of my opinions, formulated from running and watching thousands of Mythic Plus runs, as well as information from what might be considered the meta and other parsing sites like Raider.io, WoW Progress, and Warcraft logs. We are making this now especially as the first season of BFA saw quite rigid compositions and recent patch 8.1 did significant tank balancing, such that many changes may be there to consider. For this tier list, I'll be primarily focused on 4 main factors. Number 1, their overall survival kit and how it applies to the dungeon landscape, with magic and physical considered separately and equally. Number 2, their ability to provide significant utility to the group, which I define specifically as abilities that do not directly impact your ability to reduce damage, self-heal, travel, or deal damage, but have a heavy impact on the flow of the content, the capabilities of your group, and the ability to overcome awkward and dangerous situations that might occur within the dungeon. Number 3, their ability to output damage regularly, easily, and at times most important to the dungeon flow. And number 4, their mobility and their ability to kite when needed. We'll also be noting Azerite traits and when and where they may bolster the spec's strengths specifically. But with all that aside, let's get right into it. Tier 1, number 1 overall is Blood Death Knight. Blood DK has an intangible kit that without a complete dismantle will always naturally lend them strength in small group contents, and after many other tanks saw stagnation in their ability coming out of Legion, Blood DK's position has only strengthened. Their overall survivability is heavily supported by their ability to self-heal absurd amounts, a number that only increases as gear continues to come in, but they also boast the best magic defensive kit in the game thanks to AMS and its ability to prevent debuffs, and options for sizable reductions in a talent like Rune Tap. Their damage potential is below average compared to other tanks, but they contain an incredibly potent DPS cooldown in Dancing Rune Weapon, which is supported further by Azerite traits and further haste gearing and trinkets, allowing them to output near top tier levels of DPS when the CD is up and used well, leaving their only big gap potential single target and sustained AoE DPS. Their utility, however, is enough to turn a poorly optimized group into a very well optimized one. I regard Death Grip as the single greatest utility available in the video game, and it regularly creates DPS increases in dungeons, can interrupt and prevent many types of uninterruptible casts, and will overall generally speed up dungeons with pesky ranged mobs or running mobs. To boot, they have the second most useful general utility a tank could have, that being Battle Res, as after the changes in late Legion, your most bulky player will be able to potentially res all 4 other players, making the tank the ideal candidate to have the spell. Things like Gorfien's Grasp, a ranged interrupt, and a 90% decaying slow give Blood DK without question the strongest utility kit of all 6 tanks in the game, past or present. Otherwise, their mobility continues to be a sore spot for them, but has actually improved this expansion thanks to Death's Advance returning, offering them both immunity to knockback and a short CD speed increase, but their ability to kite still remains extremely strong thanks to the Grip of the Dead talent, which can actually be better than its Legion version if used well. Despite all of their strength, their Azerite options do not particularly bolster them in any significant way, with many of the DK's specific traits being incredibly underwhelming for PvE in general, but they will still benefit heavily from any armor increasing trait or traits that further supplement their self-healing like Gemhide or Impassive Visage. Overall, unless they completely remake this spec, Blood DK will always be extremely capable in 5-mans, and even after multiple nerfs, the self-healing and utility they offer can easily carry any group doing a normal gambit of keystones. Tier 1, number 2 overall, Brewmaster Monk. Brewmaster continues to be the physical bulk powerhouse that it's been for quite some time, and their overall mitigation kit contains many parallels to Blood DK's in terms of intangible strength regardless of situation or play. However, their true power lies in their heavily increased utility and prowess for kiting with respect to their peers in the tanking category. In terms of raw defense, none will match Brewmaster even after recent nerfs, as their kit simply isn't designed to just reduce damage, but but also to smooth its intake, allowing mistakes to be considerably less punishing and making the healer's job much more consistent, but still far more active when compared to a Blood Death Knight. For as good as their physical bulk is, their magic kit still remains quite lacking, and their self-healing has really not improved significantly, but in comparison to other tanks who lost considerably more coming out of Legion, the reflection is that Brewmaster is actually quite above average, which is in stark contrast to their last place ranking in these fields in 7.3.5. As mentioned, their utility kit has significantly improved and saw not only power but near mandatory elements this expansion so far. The big one, of course, is Ring of Peace, and as I mentioned in Legion, it still competes with their other utility, but with both their seasonal fixes so far, this ability continues to have insane value. Competing in the same talent tier is another incredibly useful utility in Black Ox Statue, which provides essentially unlimited threat to any mob near it with the AoE taunt option attached, which should make their kiting kit even more powerful, but it's hard to win out against Ring. On top of this, they were also given one of two buffs not able to be brought in any way without the class present, known as Mystic Touch, a 5% physical DPS increase, which obviously is extremely good given the melee meta. They also have Detox to dispel poisons and diseases, which are considerably more prevalent and dangerous than they were in Legion Mythic Plus, and Paralysis, which was extremely potent in Season 1, but may still have usage in Season 2 for varying affixes, even though it will not prevent combat. They of course still have Leg Sweep, giving them one of two AoE stuns available to all 6 tanks, and Tiger's Lust is still an option, and as potent as ever, as well, but again in a high competition tier. Unfortunately, their offense is a true weak spot for them, as they lack any sort of offensive CD whatsoever. Their persistent single target damage is very good though, but without any offensive CD to pair with Lust or Potion for difficult parts of AoE dungeon elements, Monks will always be a low tier damage dealer, simply behind Blood DK, which is already bad on its own. However, they offer the most improved Azerite spread in patch 8.1 in Season 2 after already having a solid one prior. Straight No Chaser may very well be the best trait in the game for physical reduction, something they already dominated at, and Exit Strategy offers a niche but interesting option where applicable in dungeons. More so, given how Stagger functions, they have the best synergy with Azerite Veins, one of the strongest traits in the game for Mythic Plus, as their health will very likely never reach 100% under normal tanking conditions, offering them extreme flexibility in terms of the self-healing options. Their final strength that defines the entire specs is their ability to kite and mobility to do so. They still have top tier mobility no matter what, thanks to roll, but you can lead to insane kiting alongside Ring of Peace and a natural slow, and can still make great use out of Transcendence when really prepared to kite, but frankly all you ever really need is Ring and Roll. Because of this, Brewmaster is neck and neck with Blood DK. They sit closely thanks in no small part to the prevalence of the trash difficulty in Mythic Plus, and even though Blood DK's kit does seem ideal, Brewmasters may be even better in many ways, especially when you consider their kiting potential for high keys. Tier 1 number 3, Protection Warrior. Prot Warrior being number 3 overall is something of a modern day miracle, as just a month or so ago they were arguably the worst tank ever in any dungeon meta. 8.1 saw massive overbuffs to their already wide physical defensive kit, seeing them soar substantially through the meta, but it's their flexibility in utility and potency in DPS that truly solidifies their spot here. Let's start with their most overwhelming strength, DPS output. Not just damage, but burst damage, and at times when you need it the most in 5-mans. Without question, they can output the most AoE damage in the game at the moment for all 6 tanks, and that is thanks to them having a top tier DPS CD and multiple talents to improve it. Warriors have 4 separate talents that can significantly improve their DPS, and compared to other tanks, this is truly astounding. Into the Fray, Unstoppable Force, Booming Voice, and Anger Management will give them more access to burst AoE and more power when they have it rolling, making them truly a force to be reckoned with. This has not really changed since the patch though, but the changes to their defensive kit, including Ignore Pain, make their offense a much cleaner decision and less of an all or nothing situation when you're thinking defensively. Speaking of defense, patch 8.1 provided some of the most absurd buffs any tank has ever seen in the history of a single patch. They received huge buffs to their passive armor and health, had big changes come to shield block via a shorter CD and Ignore Pain via removal from the GCD, but also benefited substantially from a game game-wide change that made ranged physical damage blockable, such as damage an archer-type mob would be doing, of which there are many this expansion. They've always had an above-average mitigation kit for magic, but still suffer heavily from self-healing problems, even though Victory Rush is more usable this expansion. Beyond this, they have a very well-rounded kit in all other fields as well, most notably utility. Their kit isn't particularly potent, but it is very wide, and that helps them fit in well with the meta, as DPS Warrior is on the outside looking in. They offer Battle Shout, which is good, but compares poorly to the Demon Hunter or Monk buffs, as it can be brought with the reduced strength from a scroll. They offer Intimidating Shout, which is just a weaker version of many other AoE interrupts other tanks have, but still something very useful in this trash caster-heavy meta. They offer Berserking Rage, which has slightly more usage this expansion, but likely will never be as strong as it was in the early days, thankfully. They have Rallying Cry, which coming into BFA I expected to be a huge addition, but the difficulty of dungeons is different than it was in Legion, and as such, we'll likely never see it to be very important. But most importantly, they have Shockwave, which is one of 2 stuns available across all 6 tank specs, offering a very powerful way to control multiple targets in this trash-heavy era. Also, uniquely, they have Spell Reflect, which is the only remnant of a bygone era where Reflects used to solo bosses from WoD challenge modes. It's certainly not what it used to be, and you really can't track it easily with DPS meters, but it will still do some crazy things in certain dungeons and is something to be aware of, especially when things slip through like they did on Gahun or in some Legion dungeons. Overall, their utility kit is very well rounded, but nothing spectacular. The same thing can be said about their Azerite and their mobility. Comparing, for example, their mobility and kiting to monks, death knights, or even demon hunters, they won't really stand up well, but can still comfortably move around easily. Comparing their traits to, say, bear, demon hunter, or brewmaster isn't going to impress anyone that much, especially after recent nerfs to Deafening Crash, but they again benefit heavily from any healing type traits, as their kit significantly lacks much of it at all. Overall, Warrior deserved this place thanks mostly to Blizzard overbuffing their physical defense. This in turn allows their offense to shine and for them to not feel like a glass cannon tank as much anymore, and when they tried to, already capable mobility, utility, and flexibility makes Warrior a comfortable pick for those not looking too closely at Brewmaster or Death Knight strength. Tier 2, number 1, number 4 overall is the Vengeance Demon Hunter. If you watched my pre-BFA launch comparison, you might be confused how I misjudged Demon Hunter's position so heavily, and to this day I'm still confused myself. Demon Hunter on paper seems to contain everything you'd want from a top tier tank, but in practice something is holding them back and I'm just not sure what it is. Their defensive kit may actually be it. Coming off Legion, they lost one of the strongest gold traits in the game in Charred Warblades, which lent extremely high self-healing to their overall kit, and even after buffs to their overall healing in BFA, that hole is unrecoverable. It really opens up the problems with their actual reduction elements and makes their formerly monstrous health pool look a bit odd now without the progressive increase in healing. They also lost their major magic defensive CD and now seemingly have to choose between either good defensive talents or talents that increase things like their offense. Despite clearly being the weakest tank in terms of overall bulk, I believe their kit is on the rise after some personal retooling and adjustments I've made. Regardless, they still hold the second highest healing mark comfortably behind Death Knight, so that's a point for their favor. Their damage also still remains a very potent thing, so much so that I would rank them comfortably second best overall, but the problem is they lack a true offensive CD, and much of their offense relies on the talent Spirit Bomb. More so, you have to be in range of mobs to do damage, and that can be a problem for Demon Hunters. Though mobility I would rate first overall still, but their kiting ability is another matter entirely. Even though they can cross huge gaps in a very short period, they lack an easy to apply slow and will rely heavily on the group members or Sigil of Chains to offer them this, which leaves them in an ironic spot. Compare their mobility to Blood DKs and it's laughably clear they can leave them in the dust, but without a reliable slow, their kiting is markedly worse, and that really hurts them considering their bulk is so low, forcing them to want to kite more than your other tanks on average. However, most notably is their utility. Despite what we've talked about, their utility is still extremely strong. Pre-launch, I would have rated their utility number 1 overall, but the error I was making was their inability to apply this to reality, whereas a Monk and DK can essentially apply it every single pack. They contain a strong CC that does not put you in combat, a ranged interrupt, multiple sigils to AoE interrupt mobs, Sigil of Chains to act as a poor man Gorfiend Grasp, and most importantly of all, they contain the best buff in the game. I thought that buff alone would propel them upwards, but considering Havoc brings it as well, and they are so absurdly in the meta at the moment, it's hard to really look at this in a vacuum and be fair about the things. However, they still have the only purge available to any tank class, and overall are comfortably above average in terms of utility without question. Another shining spot for them is their Azerite options, boasting easily the best spread for Mythic Plus. The thing about Vengeance is they have many traits that are great, and with the Season 2 extra ring available, this makes them even better when they aren't stuck to only using 3 total. Hour of Reaping, which is new in 8.1, is an amazing trait that works very well with their kit, and they have other great traits in Infernal Armor and Rigid Carapace to help build up their gaps in defense. On top of this, they have the best utility style trait in the game in Cycle of Binding, which offers heavily increased usage of their sigils, leading to even more utility overall. They also have a very potent inner option with the Soulmonger trait that becomes particularly powerful when playing defensively, and they will of course benefit heavily from traits like Gemhide, where their defense is a marked sore spot. In the end, Demon Hunter is not the best tank for Mythic Plus dungeons like I expected it to be. I still don't really understand why their utility kit, which has improved this expansion compared to Legion, isn't enough to make them see more play, but it seems their lack of easy defense really stops top groups from considering them, and that coupled with how meta Havoc is, has led formerly dedicated Demon Hunter tanks to step down from Vengeance. Tier 2, number 5 overall is the Protection Paladin. Paladin really doesn't have any glaring weaknesses. It does everything you could ask of a tank and does many of these things well. However, if you followed my tier list from Legion, you would know that this is the kiss of death for Mythic Plus tanking. If you're going to be a top tank, you need to do something extremely well. All of the tanks ahead of Paladin do something extremely well. But Paladin just doesn't have that one thing, and that really hurts them in this meta. Their biggest problem might be their utility in total. Many people point to their utility as a blessing, but to me it's the opposite, and really embodies the problem I just detailed. They have many things that they can do with their utility kit, and it's very well may be the one of the most widest and best overall utility kits, but pack to pack, it just seems to have almost no impact on the dungeon. Let's discuss what they have to illustrate this problem. They have Blessing of Freedom, which to my knowledge sees no use at all in Mythic Plus dungeons. I'm sure there is some case for it somewhere, but it's certainly seen better days. They have Blessing of Protection, which coupled with the spell warding talent used to be insanely strong on many bosses in Legion and for Necrotic, but the game is different now, and accurately using this spell to save others' lives is extremely difficult. And even using it on yourself for Necrotic is going to cause issues now that it's a physical debuff. They have Blessing of Sacrifice, which really falls into the same category as I just described. Used to be very useful when bosses were incredibly dangerous, but now it's much harder to use for impact. Something many people consider to be their best utility is their ability to interrupt at range, and that is something that is very useful in their kit, but compared to things like Death Grip, you find poor comparisons being made, especially since you aren't reliably saving Avenger's Shield just for that interrupt on a pesky range trash mob all the time. In the end, their best utility might be that they can cleanse poison and diseases, as mentioned earlier in the monk section. This synergizes extremely well with the healing meta and has a high impact on certain dungeons, but sadly, no impact at all for most packs. They still have access to healing others with the Hand of Protector talent, but it is a much weaker version this expansion than last, and in a much more competitive talent tier respectively. And finally, they still have access to either a CC or an AoE disrupt, neither of which are particularly strong compared to the other tank options, and there's always Aegis of Light for those pesky busting weeks. In the end, the utility they have looks like a strength for Paladin, but comparing it to other tanks, you see they have a lot of things to do without almost any reason to do them, making them the worst overall utility tank. Their defensive capabilities were something keeping them afloat early though. With access to Holy Shield, they came into a magic-heavy dungeons as a particularly unique pick. Arguably, that trait combined with their wide defensive kit and third strongest self-healing makes them the second best in terms of magic bulk, but is there much of a point at being second best at something Blood DK does so much better? They have a very well-rounded defensive kit and handle magic and self-healing much better than most, but when you look at how overbuffed the other shield tank became, it's a hard thing to stand up to as a paladin. Their offense was also something that looked like it was going to be a strength for Paladin for a while, and still can be considered one for many reasons. I would have them comfortably third best offensive tank right now, and their access to offense is both frequent and potent. However, unlike warriors, to maximize their offense, they have to compromise their defense, and this is a big problem in 5-mans, with trash being the main source of the problem. Again, third best just isn't good enough in this case. Their mobility is also still exceedingly disappointing. They continue to be the second worst mobility tank, but they did get a decent option for kiting this expansion thanks to their talent Consecrated Ground. The spell resembles the DK option in many ways, but its key difference is that it's not a decaying 90% debuff that can be placed anywhere you want within range. Having to drop Consecrate on your character means you have to time it properly so that the mobs stay in it maximally, and doing that often means you're not kiting that well at all. Most disappointing of all, though, is their Azerite traits. Paladin is such a rich and flavorful class, but Protection's unique Azerite traits are an utter laughingstock. They essentially only have one good trait for 5-mans, being Soaring Shield, which does synergize well with another Inspiring Vanguard, and together those two can add up to high dividends. But comparing them to the top 3 really makes you wish Blizzard got a bit more creative with the class that used to have so many different things it could offer within its base kit. The takeaway for Paladin is that they are simply the 5th best tank. That means they're better than Bear, so even after all the bad things I've said about them, that should still be something to note. In a vacuum, when not compared to any other tank, Paladin is actually very capable and does look quite strong. In practice, though, they really need a niche to fill, and in my opinion, there is none left for them unless they return to the original Paladin flavor in the form of various buffs and auras to truly give them capable group-wide utility pack to pack. And tier 3 last overall is Guardian Druid. So after what I said about Paladin, what could possibly make Bear the least effective tank in the game for Mythic Plus Dungeons? The answer really is someone has to be last. In my opinion, Bear is a very strong tank for your average 5-man play, and they do have enormous upsides after this recent patch. They are easily the second most improved tank, and unlike Paladin, they do have big carved strengths, but alongside those are big weaknesses. Let's start with their strengths. Physical defense is easily what they're best at, and that is also thanks to their insane Azerite traits, which I would say they have easily the second best spread among all tanks. They have easily the best defensive specific trait in the game in Layered Main, which, as basic as Bear's kit is, makes its main mitigation this much stronger is really something incredible. Imagine a similar power for any other kit like Paladin or Demon Hunter. On top of this, they also have Twisted Claws, which will scale extremely well in Mythic Plus, and something I'm finding out to be very strong, Waking Dream, which is technically a resto trait, but will provide significantly more healing from Ysera's gift when you have restoration affinity. This, tied with Gory Regeneration, can turn Bear into a capable self-sustained tank, with so much so that I would have them easily 4th best, but that's not really saying much when you look at who is 5th and 6th. In the end, a massive health pool and mastery, plus great defensive Azerite traits and CDs, make Bear the second most bulky physical tank in the game, only slightly ahead of Warrior, thanks to the healing and mastery they have. They even have the talent Earth Warden, which can get absurd in terms of physical reduction in dungeons, especially since, for some reason that I'll never come to understand, it counts on the HPS chart. But that's physical defense. Let's move on for now. Next, let's talk about utility. Bear got the biggest utility buffs in the game since 7.2 gave DK a Leech Aura. Ursol's Vortex added to Bear's kit is invaluable, especially when combined with Typhoon, allowing for a very poor man's Gorfine Grass type effect. But on top of that, they also have Stampeding Roar CD reduced to a 1-minute CD down from 2. Bear actually has a very capable utility kit with all of these buffs in mind, and I would place them as 4th best in terms of utility ahead of Warrior. Their kit is surprisingly wide though, even without those buffs. They still have the only speed boost any tank can offer, which can be very nice in a timed dungeon scenario. They also have Battle Res, which, as mentioned before, is incredibly powerful in the tank. They have a short CD AoE interrupt in Cap Roar, which can also be very used in niche situations to help kite. They have a ranged interrupt, which is also a charge, so arguably the best interrupt of all 6 tanks. They have Entangling Roots and Hibernate, both which cannot be used in bear form, but which can offer some CC despite neither preventing combat or being remarkably usable. But perhaps more importantly, they can dispel enrage effects, including the raging affix. See, they have really good utility. But sadly, that's where their strengths end and where the weaknesses really start to begin. Mobility is especially a problem for bear, a serious problem, as their only real mobility relies on either using their best utility for it or switching into cat form. However, with Ursols added to the kit, they become very capable kiters now, as they can couple Ursols and Typhoons separately to significantly slow mobs and keep them away. They're average kiters, but they really need Wild Charge to be baseline to help their in-combat mobility. Now, mobility is one thing, but they have two glaring weaknesses that simply can't be made up for at all right now: DPS and magic mitigation. It should be no surprise that bear has the worst DPS of any tank, as they have no offensive CD and rely almost exclusively on damage over time damage to do well. Even after a 12% buff in 8.1, they still are dismal, especially single target, doing nearly half the damage of the higher tanks on average. In AoE though, they can be quite competent, especially if you utilize specific talents and oddities in their traits. Even as a bear, they have access to potent DPS, feral, and bombkin traits, but can take Lunar Beam to significantly increase their damage in AoE especially. But when I say significantly, I mean it just makes them look like a regular tank, and it's still average at best, and requires a ton of defense lost in the process. This can be a huge problem on skittish weeks, where it's extremely difficult for bear to operate in the burst meta we have today, and will likely alone cause demoralization for players even outside of that effect. But offense can be fixed and adjusted for. Magic defense cannot be. Any high magic damage will just absolutely rip a bear open, and they are without question the 6th best tank at handling magic overall. Their only real recourse for it is to use their CDs, as nothing passive or present in talents or Azurite gear can really help them. The problem is, the removal of the artifact took with it their best magic defense, and with the changes to frenzied regen and survival instincts, I just simply cannot see how they could competently deal with magic. As such, in any situation not purely physical, they're going to rely heavily on the help of the healer to survive, and this gives them the illusion of being exceedingly squishy, despite having such insane physical bulk. In the end, bear is actually very good at some things, but so much worse at others, and that is holding them back now more than ever. Despite their very simple playstyle, I personally really enjoy bear and do play it quite often, and I'm always excited to see when other skilled druid players can make bear work in a high difficulty situation. Theoretically, all they really need is an offensive CD and Mark of Ursol or adaptive furback, but until that happens, bear is comfortably the 6th best tank overall, despite all of the upsides I mentioned. So, that's the list. What'd you think? I want to remind everyone that these are exclusively my opinions, and yours certainly will differ. Many players may look at participation rates as a form of factual, quote-unquote, evidence for or against certain things I might say here, but it's much more pertinent to examine the kit, the dungeons, and the ups and downs each might present to try to understand why the representation is what it is, and not just blindly assume that it coincides perfectly with the hierarchy of specs. Studying the theory behind each tank spec will help you better understand why they are represented in such a way, and will help you form a more complete opinion than otherwise as well. Anyway, if you disagree with my list, I encourage you to tell me why, but must ask that out of respect to the time that this took, you are prepared to compare all 6 tanks within whichever metric you wish to give your opinion on. Far too many replies are people just disagreeing with typically my last 2 picks in a certain way, but if you aren't willing to compare those picks to the top, all 6 tanks total, and explain why they should be higher than another tank, then you are missing the point of the video, and I simply won't have time to communicate with players doing this. Typically, I would read and respond to every single comment on the video as it comes in, but instead, this time I'm going to be making an entirely subsequent video where I read all the comments and reply to them at length to prevent my own opinions from further creating bias in the comment section, but also to allow for a longer form discussion to take place so that I may better learn from the places I might have gone wrong. Anyway, I want to thank you for watching and supporting the channel in the video. You should look forward to more tier lists coming next, including DPS and healing ones, as well as any updates to tanking specifically that might come with hotfixes or in patch 8.1.5. As always, thanks for watching, and we'll see you guys in the next one.